In this video, we're going to be discussing the Alter Rebbe, the Rabbi Schneur Zalman of Liadi, the founder of the Chabad Chassidic movement, and really important codifier of Jewish law, which is why we're putting him in this series. We'll try our best to keep it to short as possible. We could talk hours about the Alter Rebbe, as he is known in the Chassidic circles. He's also known as the Baal HaTanya, the author of the Tanya, his Chassidic magnum opus, or Rabbeinu Hazaken in Hebrew, which means the same as the Alter Rebbe, the old rabbi. He was called that because many of the later generations, the next couple generations of his Chassidim, wanted to figure out a way to refer to him, and so they decided to call him the old rabbi versus the current Rebbe at the time, his grandson. He was born in the year 1645 and passed away in the year 1813. He was born to a Hasidic family. The Baal Shem Tov was a new phenomena at the time. His father was a Chassid of the Baal Shem Tov. However, the Baal Shem Tov, even though he promised them the birth of a son, he told his parents, Rabbi Baruch, that even though that he would have a son, that he would be a light unto the world and a very important Hasidic personality. He was not to meet the Baal Shem Tov. The only time the exception was that for his Upsherinish, his third birthday, he was allowed to meet the Baal Shem Tov. And again, this is in what the Jews call Lithuania kind of area. He was born in Lyazna, which is White Russia, essentially. That's what the Jews call Lita or White Russia, Belarus. So he was born there. He was allowed to see the Baal Shem Tov. They did not tell him who he was. The Baal Shem Tov's name was never mentioned in his home, and he eventually went to learn in this young man. He was a tremendous, tremendous scholar, and even as a very young man, we could go on and on about some of his important life events during his youth, but we'll try to go quickly. He studied in the city of Lubavitch. Which eventually becomes the seat of his movement in the next generation. His son moved to Lubavitch. He eventually married a girl from Vitebsk, again similar area in Russia, from the Segal family, a really, really wealthy family, at the age of 14, which was common back then. And eventually he starts to gather a little following. At this point, he was already developing kind of his system, which would be later known as the Chabad system, which was a system of using intellectual thought to create something to base your Judaism off. There was a debate, should we focus on Torah study? Should we focus on prayer? Should we focus on passion? And the Alter Rebbe, Rabbi Schneur Zalman, really focused on intellect. If we understand things properly, we could then have emotions based on those things. That was kind of the system already developing at that time before he was introduced to Hasidism and the Hasidic movement. At a young age, at the age of about 16 to 18, somewhere around there, he decides he needs a Rebbe. He needs a teacher who's going to teach him on his level, and he found no one in his area who could teach him. So he said either he's going to go to Vilna, which was close by, again, and still in that same area of White Russia, or he could go to Mezritch, which is deep in the Ukraine, where the Hasidic movement. And he said, well, in the focus in Vilna was on Torah study. He said, Torah study, I know a little bit. The focus in Mezritch was prayer, and prayer he felt he did not know. And he went to Mezritch. At the time, he already had a small following of people. They called him a Shaloyid. He was basically a follower of the previous generations, Rabbi Yeshaya Halevi Horowitz, who had written many Kabbalistic works, and he prayed from the Siddur of the Shalah. At any rate, he travels to Mezritch, and he decides to stay, and he becomes one of the greatest of the students of the Maggid of Mezritch, the successor to the Baal Shem Tov. And he becomes totally connected to the Hasidic movement. And at some point, he was known to be one of the youngest student of the Maggid, and he's one of the 120 big students. And eventually, the Maggid gives him private tutoring lessons and grooms him for leadership. The Maggid at some point said that in heaven they decided that there has to be a new Shulchan Aruch written. There has to be a new code of Jewish law written, because at this point, as we've discussed in previous videos, so many debates and arguments have come out for between the later generations, that halacha was no longer succinct as it was after the writing of the Shulchan Aruch, which again, the writing of the Shulchan Aruch was the point was to make succinct laws that everyone knew what to do. But now it was getting out of hand that even big rabbis couldn't figure out what the halacha was, because there's so many debates and so many commentaries on the Shulchan Aruch. So he said that in heaven it was decided to write a new Shulchan Aruch, and the Maggid picked the Alter Rebbe. He said, "You are the greatest of my students," and he gave him the job to write the Shulchan Aruch, which he began at a very young age, in his 20s. He continued writing until his passing on different sections. He wrote sections. His main Shulchan Aruch was on, which is later called either the Shulchan Aruch Harav. It's also called the Shulchan Aruch of the Tanya, or in the Chassidic circles, the Alter Rebbe Shulchan Aruch. And he wrote essentially on the main section was on Orach Chaim, which is again the laws of daily life. And on this he wrote like a Shulchan Aruch. He did not follow the seifim, the sections, meaning he followed the simonim, which is like the same simonim as the Shulchan Aruch followed, which were the same simonim that the Torah followed, which is like the chapters, I guess you could say. But the sub-chapters he did not. He wrote his own in his own style. And one of the things that the Maggid instructed him was to write the laws with the reasonings. And again, we talked about this previous videos, that this is one of the struggles of writing Jewish law. If you write too many of the reasonings, the law gets lost. If you write too many, if you write too just the laws, you miss the reasons. And the Alter Rebbe found a balance, and he was able to write a Shulchan Aruch with the laws and their reasons, and it's very, very understandable. He wrote this again throughout his life until his passing, and even in his later years, he was writing the later parts of the Shulchan Aruch. He wrote on Yeridea as well, and which again we talked about is the laws of what's forbidden, what is permitted. And on Yeridea, though, he wrote it as a commentary on the Shulchan Aruch. So he wrote it as a commentary, and it's a very different style than the Shulchan Aruch that he wrote like a standalone book on Orach Chaim. He as well wrote a later version of it. He wrote it's called the Madur Basra, a second version. He also wrote later Kuntras Achron, which was like kind of his very long essays explaining these things. In his Shulchan Aruch, he relied on certain previous generations' rabbis. In Orach Chaim, he relied very much on the Magen Avram. In Hilchos Nida and Yeridea, he followed very much the Crazy Placey, Rabbi Yonason Eibschitz. And eventually, later on, he decided that he relied too much on these other rabbis, and he decided to write his own understanding. And this was kind of in his later writings, which were the writings that he wrote on the Siddur. He wrote later in his life, he published a Siddur. He took 60 Siddurim. He had 60 Siddurim in front of him, and he figured out the exact nusach, the perfect liturgy. And it took him years to publish his own Siddur, so that the Chassidic community could have a Siddur that would follow his instructions. It took him again from 60 Siddurim. So he also wrote on the Siddur. He wrote some laws that are relevant on the laws of Shabbos, on the laws of prayer, and other things, the laws of making blessings. And in the Siddur, he followed much more of his own reasoning, as well as in his second version of the Shulchan Aruch, which there are only a few pieces of that we have that he wrote. He wrote, and again, the Kuntras Achron as well, in the he wrote again later, which again following is more of his own opinion on meaning going away from relying on previous rabbis and saying we're basically going to follow this rabbi. He kind of wrote more his own understanding. So amongst the Hasidic community, it became common to follow the Alter Rebbe's Shulchan Aruch, because even if they were not a follower of the Chabad movement, which follow all the Alter Rebbe's laws and decisions, but they felt because the Maggid, the successor to the Baal Shem Tov and the leader of all Hasidim had instructed him to write the Shulchan Aruch, they felt that they should follow his laws as well. They also, however, felt that he was never instructed to write later the Siddur or the other writings, so they did not follow those. Interesting idea. In my opinion, it's a little bit kind of splitting the baby, but that is generally what is followed. So now, as a Chassidic master, the Alter Rebbe, after the passing of the Maggid in 1772. 1772, 1773, around then, he eventually followed some of his colleagues, including the son of the Maggid, Rabbi Avram Hamalach. He also followed, until his passing, shortly thereafter, he followed Rabbi Menachem Mendel of Vitebsk for a few years until his going to Israel. But a few years after the Maggid's passing, he opened up shop in his hometown of Liozna, and he became the Liozna Rebbe, and he had thousands of followers. He opened up Chadorim, which were like advanced study groups where they would study Kabbalah and Chassidus and Jewish law and Gemara, and very, very high level scholarship. He as well, began to say Chassidic discourses, and which were all the teachings of the Maggid. And in the beginning, they were very, very short. Eventually, they got longer, and after his arrest, which we'll talk about in a second, they became very long, comparatively. And those are eventually were collected. They were written. He did not write them himself. They were collected and written as written down by his Hasidim, and it became the common practice of having what is called Chazara. They would review it, and then they would edit them and write them down as they had heard them, and they had different versions. They had some of them, would write it down in different styles, because again, the Alter Rebbe was saying it in Yiddish, as was the custom of the Baal Shem Tov and his student the Maggid. They would talk in Yiddish, but they would write down their teachings in Hebrew. So when you're writing it down, and again, you're writing it, the style of writing is different than the style of speaking. So it became different versions, and eventually was published by his grandson in 2 volumes, Likutei Torah and Torah and Likutei Torah, actually, on the Parsha. And only later, now just in our generation, maybe in the past 20 years, has all the Alter Rebbe's, really in the past 70 years, but much more recently, in the past 20 years, they've now finally finished printing all the Alter Rebbe's Chassidic discourses that are extant from copies and handwritten manuscripts from his students and his successors. Now, as far as his arrest, he was arrested in 1798 on trumped-up charges for having for supporting the Turkish government, because he was involved with sending relief money to Eretz Yisrael. What he founded Kol Chabad, which still exists to this day, the largest charity today in Israel. At the time, was a small startup charity trying to help his colleagues who were impoverished, living in the land of Israel. They accused him of espionage and all kinds of stuff, and it was all trumped up by his opponents of the Chassidic movement. He was arrested for 53 days and released on Yutas Kislev, which until today is a special holiday for Chassidim, which also happened to be the yahrzeit of his teacher, the Maggid of Mezritch. And after he was released, he felt that this was a message to him from on high, that this was like an approval of his methods of teaching Chassidus in the Chabad way, which again was a very intellectual way, and he really focused on that. Eventually, he was arrested again, this time under house arrest, and he was living in Petersburg, and he moves to the town of Liadi. That was kind of like the deal struck with him and the government, was he was going to move to another town where the governor said they would watch him. At any rate, he moves to Liadi, where he becomes very well known by that name as Rabbi Schneur Zalman of Liadi. It's very, very close by to that area. Maybe a few towns over. Back then, it probably a long journey, but today it would be half an hour car drive or something like that. Just a few kilometers over. He moves to this town, and he really starts to become the Chabad Rebbe in the full sense. For the last 10 years or so of his life, he is really on these much longer discourses, much more elaborate, much more a smaller group at this point. Many of the kind of the Hasidic landscape of White Russia changed a little bit, and he had a much different style of teaching Hasidus, teaching Hasidic teachings. Now, previously, and when he lived in Liozna, he was so overwhelmed by the amount of visitors. He had to make rules about how long people could come. That kind of changed because of the landscape of other Hasidic Rebbes coming to that area. So he was no longer the exclusive Hasidic Rebbe of White Russia. So therefore, he was able to. When he moved to Liadi, there were no more rules about how often people could come and stuff like that. But he was still obviously a very big Hasidic Rebbe, and probably the biggest Hasidic Rebbe, to the point where all the charges of the people who were against the Hasidic movement were all levied against him because of his leadership. In fact, after the Maggid's passing, he was officially in charge of all Hasidic activities for the first 5 years until that splintered. Can't mention the Alter Rebbe without mentioning the Tanya. The Tanya is his magnum opus, and he wrote it it was printed in 1797, I believe. And the Tanya was a response to the fact that he was very overwhelmed with yechidus, with personal audiences, giving people advice and direction in serving God. And he felt that it was not sustainable for him alone to do that. So therefore, he decided he was going to write a book of basically what he called it, a book of answers to that he had collected. That's what he said that he wrote. According to some versions, it took him 20 years. According to other versions, it was less time. But either way, he spent a tremendous amount of time putting in his effort. It becomes his magnum opus, becomes what we call the written Torah of the Hasidic movement. And he really changes a whole new way of looking at divine service. And he calls it the Sefer Shel Beinanim, the book of the intermediate. And essentially, his thesis is that most Jews of our generation are not great righteous people who never sin, but we are struggling Jews, and we need to figure out how can we find meaning and purpose and victory through struggling in our service of God with the stumbles that come along the way. He eventually passes away in 1813, running away in January of 1813, running away from Napoleon. He despised Napoleon, and he did not want to live under Napoleon's rule for one moment, so he ran away from Liadi. Napoleon was looking for him. He did send some of his Hasidim to help spy on Napoleon for the Russian government, which his descendants were rewarded for that. And of course, he runs away, and he ends up deep in the Ukraine in the cold winter. And at the age of 68, I believe, 62, he passes away, and I could be wrong on the age. I apologize. He passes away, and he is buried in Hadych in Ukraine, today Ukraine. And the Alter Rebbe's legacy, obviously, he was succeeded by his son, the Alter Rebbe, which we'll talk about maybe in another video. He was succeeded by his son and eventually his grandson, and till today, the Chabad Chassidic movement is flourishing as probably one of the most important Chassidic movements in the world today. But even at the time, as a unique Russian style, I guess you could say, intellectual focus on intellect movement, very different than the Galicianer, Polish Hasidic movements, or even the movements in Ukraine. As far as his Hasidic thought is still studied till today, whether it's directly through the study of the Tanya, which in today's Chabad movement is studied in a daily fashion, besides in a more, I'm sure when you're in yeshiva and you have time, you could study it in a more broad way, but there's a daily cycle. We study every single day and finish it in a year. As well as whether there's also a Hasidic custom to study his Likutei Torah and Torah Or, finish the Parsha, which could be sometimes many, many pages, finish the Parsha every single week of his discourses on that Parsha. And as well, every Chabad Chassidic Rebbe that followed, all his successors, all they did was take his teachings and develop them. And that is something that, so in other words, if you're finding a Hasidic discourse from any, whether it's the Lubavitcher Rebbe, the previous Rebbe, the Rebbe Rashab, the Rebbe Marash, any of the Hasidic Rebbes, all they did was they took a mimer from the previous Rebbe, whether it was their immediate predecessor, or from the Alter Rebbe, or from any of the other 7 Rebbes of Chabad, and they would develop it. So it all traces back to the Alter Rebbe. Everything goes back to him, and all the Hasidic discourses that are taught by all the Hasidic Rebbe, all the Chabad Chassidic Rebbes that followed, are all his teachings. So again, directly and indirectly follow his teachings. And again, as far as halacha goes, Jewish law, his Shulchan Aruch Harav is studied till today. It's been reprinted now. I should mention his Shulchan Aruch was printed after his lifetime. Most of his books were printed after his lifetime. The only book that was printed in his lifetime directly by him was the Tanya. The Siddur, it seems, was printed in his lifetime as well. There's debate amongst historians, but it's pretty much been proven that it was printed in his lifetime in the in the early 1800s. It was for sure printed. There seems evidence that it was printed in his lifetime because his Hasidim wanted to follow his liturgy. He also was printed in his lifetime from the there was the laws of Talmud Torah, the laws of Torah study was printed in his lifetime. Also, the laws of Netilas Yadayim and the laws of the washing hands, the laws of brachas, certain versions of that was printed in his lifetime. Unfortunately, most of his original manuscripts were burned. They lived in these small little shtetl, these small little towns in White Russia, where all the houses were made of timber and very easily burned. There were many, many fires in Lubavitch and in Liadi, and to the point where all his original manuscripts of the Shulchan Aruch unfortunately burned, except a few scraps. All of it was printed by his children using copies that were made. So we don't have the extant of the manuscripts, but many that has been printed, and now in more recent years it has been reprinted in a new beautiful style with notes, and you could look at, where they compare his rulings from, the Shulchan Aruch to the Siddur and vice versa. And until today is discussed his rulings and trying to understand his rulings, especially for those of the Hasidic community who follow his rulings. Very important to keep studying them and comparing them and trying to apply them. So that's something that happens to this day. And of course, the Chabad movement flourishes to this day and keeps on flourishing, all started by the Alter Rebbe, Rabbi Schneur Zalman. I should also mention that he was a descendant of the Maharal of Prague, a very important rabbinic and Kabbalistic leader, who traces his lineage back all the way to King David through Rashi and all other important rabbis all the way back to King David. So a tremendous amount of yichus in that family, and there's much more we could go into. We could talk for hours about the Alter Rebbe. Just thought I would give a small little overview of his life, his works, and if there's something I missed, I could have said, should have said, be happy to discuss in the comments. And maybe we'll do this again with Alter Rebbe or other Hasidic leaders, God willing. And looking forward to seeing you in the next video.